The President's announcement of Tony Scott as the United States Chief Information Officer is an important opportunity for our nation. With the radical evolution of information technology, the federal government has an unprecedented opportunity to enhance how we deliver the services to the American people and spark greater innovation in the digital revolution. Tony brings over 35 years of global leadership and management experience to build on the progress and drive continued success. This is Tony's first talk in his new role, so we're very pleased to have him at our summit today. Please join me in welcoming our United States Chief Information Officer, Tony Scott.
Actually, I have to correct the record. This is actually my second. The other was a little bit earlier this morning, so, but I guess it all counts. If it's in the same day, we'll call it the first day of getting out and getting around. And thanks for the warm reception. It's my pleasure, actually, to act in this role. You know, as I learned about the opportunity and thought about what could be done with the federal government and information that the federal government has, I think you'd argue there's just no more exciting opportunity on the planet in some sense. So, you know, I'll come back and talk to you in a couple of years and we'll see where we got to. I guess that's the proof at the end of the day. So I work in the Office of Management and Budget, and so there's no discussion that can take place without talking about all the different initiatives that we have going on. And so I thought I would mention a few of them this morning, and I'll try to go through the slides that I have pretty quickly, and then we can get to some hopefully good conversation. So let me get back to the beginning here. All right. So I think, as many of you know, there's a set of open government initiatives in the federal government that are, I think, powerful examples of what can be done with the right policies and the right practice in place. And we have a few of them listed here that I think are the beginnings of what can be a big impact in this particular space. Now, one of the problems, obviously, that we have is you can have all the policies in the world and you can have all of the regulation in the world, but if the data is trapped in old systems that are hard to get to, that aren't presented in the right way or made available in the right way, it's not very useful. So I'm very big on the practicality side of things. I told the story earlier this morning that I'm all about landing the airplane. I'm a pilot. And you can teach anybody to take an airplane off in a few minutes. If any of you have ever been a pilot or known a pilot, this is something I could teach anybody in this room in a few minutes. It's very easy. And very few pilots actually screw up taking an airplane off. Landing is the hard part. And a good landing is even harder. My pilot friends say a good landing is one that you can walk away from. A great landing is one where you can use the airplane again. And I think we have that same sort of challenge in front of us in terms of our open data and open government initiatives. So the first one is M1006. It's the Open Government Initiative. I'm sure many of you in the room are familiar with that. And I think we're off to generally a good start. It started in 2009 and promotes the principles of transparency and accountability in government. And I think this is generally a good thing. And, you know, what I would say is we're still probably in early days when it comes to completely understanding the impact that this will have. And we've got a lot more to go. We have an open policy data policy. You can read the slide here. I won't go through this in detail. Part of the FATARA Act, which my office is responsible for writing the rules for different government agencies, will also include guidance to CIOs in terms of how we get better at open data and making this powerful tool available to all. The notion of open by default is, I think, a core idea and core principle here. And it's not just the data, it's also the algorithms and some of the other technology that goes with it, so that people can fully embrace and use the data that the government has. We all see the end results of data every day. The government publishes a bunch of statistics, publishes the results of a bunch of studies, but sometimes you just want to know, how did they get there? How did they calculate that? How did they figure out the answer to that particular question? And so that's part and parcel of what we continue to have to do here. Now, this is a financial regulation summit, I'm told, and so certainly the SEC is, I think, a good example of great progress in this particular space. And again, I think there's a great future ahead of us. Here's an example of some of the things that they're doing that I think are to be commended. Data.gov is a place where you can go get access to a lot of information. How many of you here have used data.gov, just out of curiosity? Okay, good. That's a great showing. For those of you that haven't, raise your hand if you're willing to in this audience. Okay. I'd love to know why not from those of you that haven't, and from those of you that have, I'd love to know your experience. Part of the challenge, I think, here is the whole federal government digitizes its business processes, is improving the rich feedback that you get from digitization. And just as consumer companies like Amazon and eBay and so on understand a lot about what their customers want and how they act on their sites, and we certainly did that at Microsoft when I was there, the government needs the same kind of feedback in terms of the websites and data that we create. And so whether it's how you click and what you click on the sites, or whether it's you're telling me in an email or a tweet or whatever it happens to be, how we're doing, that's important feedback in terms of us making all of these sites better. We have some cross-agency goals. So part of OMB's efforts are to make sure that not only in agencies but across agencies we're driving the right kind of activity and the right kind of behavior. So we have these CAP goals, and fortunately there's one in this particular space as well. And you'll hear more about that as we go along. The economic benefit of getting this right is, I think 1 trillion was the estimate that was given. I think it's probably even greater than that. And you can see examples in your everyday life. I have to apologize for being late. I was supposed to be here a little bit earlier. And uncharacteristically, I relied on an old method for getting here. I was over at our office at the Eisenhower Executive Office Building, and I rushed outside and I raised my hand and took a taxi cab. And the problem was the taxi driver didn't know where this was. Never heard of it. Took me to the wrong place. I'm new to Washington. I didn't know where I was going. Didn't know that we were headed the wrong place. What did I do? Anybody ever use an app called Waze? It's a phenomenal application. It uses, GPS data and gets information from data that the government has published. And So I was, in short order, directing the taxi driver how to get here. Never been over here before. But when you think about the opportunity to save time, save money, do things more efficiently as a result of widely shared and open data, this morning, to me, was just proof case again of the power and the opportunity for that. So, and there's a bazillion examples. I'll wrap up by talking about a couple of other things. We have the Project Open Data, which is an initiative I'm very excited about. We have a dashboard that'll go across all the federal agencies in terms of our performance. You'll be able to access this if you haven't already and see how we're doing. And again, I love to have rich feedback from you in terms of how you think we could do this better. There's data.gov, and this is where you can find all of the U.S. government's open data. How many of you use this? A fewer number of you, okay. Well, there's a reason, so I'd love to understand what that is as well. There's a plethora of stuff there. I haven't been through it all personally, I will tell you. In 6 weeks on the job, I think I've looked at half of 0.5% of the stuff that's on there. But what I found was actually pretty interesting. This is something that, again, is, I think, a valuable source of information in many sectors. I was over visiting the Department of Agriculture the other day, and they were sharing with me some of the great work they've done in this particular space. And I'm behind the scenes there cheering them and the other agencies on in this regard. And then we have the financial regulation space. This is not an area, I'll admit, I'm an expert on. I'm a lawyer and an IT guy by training, and so I try to stay as far away from financial regulation as possible. I have enough issues just in my own personal space in this regard, so I don't like telling banks and stock exchanges and all the rest of it what they should do. But I think the power of the notion is very important in terms of free markets and in terms of transparency and creating a fair system for all players. I think that may be the end here. And I'll finish by just telling you a story that's my own personal journey in the data space. That I think speaks to the promise of this for the future. Many years ago, in the mid-90s, I was hired by Bristol Myers Squibb, one of the big pharmaceutical companies. And one of the first things I heard was about the data problem that they had. And this was a case where they would collect information about the products that they made from pharmacies all over the world. And the data would come in on a monthly basis, and it would take almost a month for them to process all that data and come out with information that was useful to them in terms of their market trends and so on. Now, if it takes you a month to digest the data that you get on a monthly basis, by definition, you're going to be slow. You're not going to be responsive in your marketplace. When I got to General Motors, I discovered that one of the problems they had was it took 5.5 years to design and market an automobile in what was then and still is a fashion business. Now, you tell me what fashions are going to be 5 years from now, and, well, we could have an interesting conversation outside the room and predict the future. And when I got to the Walt Disney Company, the business was transforming from one of our business units was the film business, the Walt Disney Motion Pictures. And they thought of themselves as filmmakers, literally as in Kodak film. And within 3 years, that had whole business had digitized, and we were downloading, filming digitally, downloading digital files, and so on. And in each of these cases that I mentioned, the power of technology and the power of data in a very short period of time completely transformed the industry. In the Bristol-Myers Squibb case, within 3 years, technology had advanced to the point where that monthly data could be digested and dissected and turned into useful information, first in 3 or 4 days, then in several hours. All of that in just a 3-year period of time. At General Motors, that 5.5-year product development process, by applying digital techniques to it and breaking up the silos of information that the automotive company had, allowed them to go to 18 months to design and develop an automobile. Very powerful in terms of what you can do in the marketplace. In the Disney case, the better use of information and digitizing these business processes and creating data that different organizations could share across the various business units of the Walt Disney Company translated into hundreds of millions of dollars in additional sales. Think of releasing the movie like Pirates of the Caribbean, and you could simultaneously, as you're making the movie, get that information out to your suppliers who are making souvenirs and things for the theme parks and so on. And all of these are examples of transformative data, not always open, I admit in the private case, but the power of sharing data and using it in creative ways. And that's why I think the $1 trillion estimate is low. In the case of Microsoft and many of its peer companies, the flipping this on its edge and creating cloud platforms that we can now use those tools to manage data and to share it and to collaborate on it and to do things with it that we never imagined before, I think is our opportunity, the opportunity of a lifetime, really, in the next several years. And so I'm very, very excited about that opportunity and very excited about what we can do in the federal government as well to help. So I think I'll stop there and take any questions that you might have. And we're okay on time, I assume? Okay, good.
So if you could help me manage the questions, I'll kick the first one off from here, which is President Obama's open data policy requires federal agencies to standardize and publish their data. It's mandatory for departments, but voluntary for independent agencies and most financial regulators. Have you seen independent financial regulators voluntarily pursuing open data? And how would you recommend that these independent regulators approach the open data policy?
Yeah, I haven't done an inventory, if you will, so the part of what have I seen, I probably can't answer, but that inventory notion, I think, is central to the whole argument. One of the biggest challenges I think that there is many organizations don't really have an inventory of the data that they have. It's not automated, doesn't show up in a way that makes it easy for you as a leader or as an executive to say, oh, I've got this stuff and here's what I could do with it. And so this is one of the things that I think we're going to have a lot more conversation about in the federal government. We have, for security reasons, a notion of something called CDM, Continuous Diagnostics and Monitoring. But we don't have continuous inventory and reporting as a parallel sort of example. And so I think there's more that we can do to make sure we have a much more automated way of understanding what data we have, where it is, whether it's accessible or not, so that agencies and other organizations can figure out what to do with it and make it available. And that automation of that is key. The example I would give you is, even in our data center consolidation initiative, if you don't have a really good understanding of what's in the data center, and it's up to date and timely and refreshed all the time, it makes it a lot harder to figure out how do I consolidate, how do I move those workloads. I think the same exact thing is true of data. If you don't have a good, up-to-the-minute inventory of what that is, then making it available is just a lot harder.
Right. Thank you, Tony. First question from the audience, right here on the aisle.
Hi, thank you. My question is about, you mentioned earlier you have data trapped in old systems. It's a big problem. I think a lot of people were also, in a parallel sense, surprised to learn government emails sent by high officials aren't automatically saved and preserved for the future. What do you see as the government can do and what you can do on the acquisitions front to make sure that these record keeping and also these data, keeping these data machine readable, is baked into the acquisitions process? So when you get the technology, you know it's going to save what you want.
Yeah, I'll admit this is a sort of 6-week view, so check back with me in a couple of months. But so far, my view is that it's not as much an acquisition issue as it is an implementation issue. I think that's a space where at least my office has more, I'll say influence in terms of the outcomes. So I'm, and you probably derived this from my opening comments, I'm a land the plane guy. And I think that's the area I'm going to try to focus on, which is what are the things that we can do from an implementation perspective that says, let's follow the various rules and regulations that exist and do that in a more consistent way across the government. I'm not as familiar on the acquisition side, quite frankly, but in my experience, I would guess that's not really where the problem is. It's probably a lot more in the implementation. We have many examples in the federal government and in the private sector where we've bought perfectly good technology, had a great contract, a great idea in terms of what we were going to do. We just didn't land the plane, and I think that's where a lot of focus has to be.
Thank you. I think we had a question over here.
Drew Doggett, writer at Meritalk. You spoke earlier about FITARA, and we know that that'll grade CIOs greater authority, especially with cloud computing and the rise of these new technologies. And with Commerce just announcing their new chief data officer last week, actually at South by Southwest, and we've seen about half a dozen cabinet-level agencies investing in more CDOs and CAOs. Do you see these positions being parallel to the CIO or working under? Overall, how do you see the hierarchy of these IT investments changing in the near future?
Yeah, well, unlike FITARA, there's not a congressional act that mandates where the data guys go, like there is with FITARA, and it's pretty specific in that particular case. But Megan and I have talked a lot about this sort of triumvirate that working together in most federal agencies could be a very powerful mechanism, and it's the CIO, it's the data person, and the CTO in that agency all sort of working together. And that's really my view of how this is going to work, is it's a collaboration across a number of different elements that's going to get us where we need to go in this. There's an analogy that I just love, which is, we're all kind of in a canoe, and you can't say to the other people in the canoe, hey, your end of the canoe is sinking, because any of you that have ever been in a canoe know that one end goes down, we all go down, kind of thing. And I think that's kind of the role that the CIOs have to play with the data folks in the organization. One enables and empowers the other, and vice versa. And there is that relationship with the CTO as well, where we can really harness new and emerging technology as well. So I think it's going to be an interesting time. The old sort of command and control structures that used to work in a lot of places are probably going to break down into a much more collaborative sort of entity, if you will, in terms of how they actually work in practice.
Thank you. A couple questions over here.
Thanks. Tom Marston with Dun & Bradstreet. I have a statement and a question. The statement is along the lines of the insights that may be locked in government data sources. many of those in textual format. And I'm thinking in particular cases of pending fraud or actual fraud. So think about unlocking that, and you start to move down to the next generation, which is true insight, as opposed to step one or stage one, which is let's put out in the public domain as much content as possible. So the question is, my belief that some of the data assets that are perhaps most valuable are locked away. Perhaps agencies or departments don't have the authority to disclose. I'm curious to see, or if you're anticipating a role for your office to cajole, incent, and possibly even fund additional efforts by departments and agencies to move additional data out into the public domain.
Yeah, I think generally speaking, I think you're headed the right direction. And I think this is true across the board. I know it's true in the private company, public company space. The amount of data that's actually captured, curated, and preserved in some fashion that it's actually usable and accessible is a tiny fraction of everything that's produced by anybody. It's true in our personal lives as well. You know, we just moving around every day generate tons of data, whether we're shopping or using Waze or whatever it happens to be. And yet a small fraction of that is actually accessible and usable to us today. And I think there's a duality of this problem. You know, as we generate more and more data, there's a challenge to how do you make some amount of that, some greater amount of that usable, and how do you get the signal to noise ratio right in terms of what's usable. So I'm very encouraged by some of the R&D work that's going on at major universities and in Silicon Valley in particular, in terms of helping filter out the useful from the just, sort of who cares kind of stuff. And I think we will, in the next couple of years have to advance the cause that you talk about by leveraging some of that new technology. You know, we have a whole generation of folks coming along that will be my successors and the next group of folks that lead and manage these organizations that grew up in a world of search, and that's the primary way that you get information. And I think we're just going to have to sort of embrace that as we go forward. In the federal government, I think we have to do it, obviously in a responsible way. And one of the things that I've figured out already in 6 weeks is there's a little bit of a Byzantine course through some of these things that can make it hard, and we've got to figure out ways to make that simpler.
We have 2 questions over here.
Thank you. Robert Naylor, former CIO for the FCC and SBA. Open data was great. We published a lot of data sets. The challenge is, what about data in context? Just
Yes.
looking at the data by itself, even with the federal procurement database, the challenge between inaccuracies and actual outliers that make sense. What are you doing, or what are your thoughts for helping to take the data.gov to the next level from a data integrity and then a data in context?
Well, I think context matters for a lot of things, obviously, and without context, you can absolutely come to the wrong conclusion. And my example this morning is just a perfect example. I had to give Waze a couple of clues about where I was trying to go because it just didn't know what 5th and Market or 5th and Florida was. What city was I talking about? What country was I in? Some of those kinds of things. I think it's a great example. I don't know how to do that from a regulatory standpoint so much. I think what we've got to do is engage subject matter experts and communities at large to help us get that right. If you look at Wikipedia, I think it's a great example of, over time things get curated and, errors get corrected and you get the right context for the discussion to take place, and you can see what other people think, and over time you kind of can figure it out. And so I think the thing that I'm convinced of is social is not a thing by itself. It's just a feature of every application in some way. And the more you can expose information and data to people who know and care about that, you're more likely to come out with the right answer. And you got to be careful about special interests, taking it the wrong way. But I think that's the answer is somewhere in there.
Question, John?
Yes. What is the Office of the CIO doing to promote the interaction or the collaboration between government and industry to drive the Open Data Initiative?
Well, it's I think if you saw President Obama in Stanford a couple of weeks ago, it was my first week on the job, and the first thing I know is I flew into Washington, and then the president took off the other way and went 2 miles from my house to announce this cybersecurity summit. And one of the core features of that is more collaboration with private industry on what I think is the challenge of this decade, which is cybersecurity. And so I think he believes, and I know I believe, and the administration believes in this public-private partnership as a core sort of tenet in terms of how we go forward. In terms of specific initiatives, I'm 6 weeks into it, so I don't have a specific idea yet in terms of all the things that we can do. I will tell you I was recruited into the role because I was already participating in an initiative to try to figure out how to get private industry more engaged in STEM and getting women, minorities, veterans, and other underrepresented groups into some of these kind of critical roles. And a core part of that program was engage with private industry and create awareness and help find the pipeline of talent that we need for those critical roles. So I think it's core to what we're doing going forward.
Thanks. Our last question will be here, second row.
Hi, Dennis Wisnowski, the former Chief Technology Officer and Chief Architect for Business and DoD, and now Enterprise Data Management Council, and also a pilot.
All right.
I owned an Aerostar Piper.
Cool.
Now a Piper Cub. So
I'm flying a Cirrus, so.
Oh, okay, very good. Landing is important, but the first thing, of course, is the flight plan. You have a couple of years to go here. Do you intend to create your own flight plan, use an old flight plan, or what direction are you going? After 6 weeks, maybe you don't know yet. One of the things that was started that I thought stopped was use of semantic web technology for data.gov, and it's kind of gone. So if I were doing a flight plan, I would include that in the future.
Yeah. I should probably be careful about stretching the flying analogy too far, but as you know, pilots rely on pilot reports and other kinds of things, and filing a flight plan is a great idea. Some of them are unique, and some of them are just obviously repeats of what everybody else has done before. In a place that I lived in California, the weather was good all the time, and so the flight plans often were pretty boring. It's a little more exciting around here with weather and complicated airspaces and so on. But the point that was made earlier, context, I think is important. And while semantic web is, I think, fallen out of favor to some degree, even more broadly than just here at the government level, I think there's some interesting research that's going on right now that may actually create a resurgence of that movement and that kind of thinking in a way that will allow us to use some of those tools maybe a little bit more effectively than the first go around. And I think this is often the case with technology. The first occurrence of it or the first instance of it is kind of interesting, and you can do some fun things with it, but then it often takes 2 or 3 turns of the crank before you really figure out how are you going to use it, and you can scale it out to some level that's useful. And I think that's one of the cases for the semantic web. You've got a big set of cloud platforms now that if you take some of that core technology and put it on a great cloud platform, I think you can do amazing things with it. So I think it'll come back around.
So Tony, we wish to wish you a safe landing with your work on open data. We need to use the plane again. Thank you for your insight today. I think we also would recommend Uber back to the White House.
Yes, absolutely.
And a round of applause for Tony.
All right, thank you.